I was born in a small town in Sweden called Nyköping. I worked in Boston for a little while in the early 90s. On the weekends I always took the train down to New York. I mean, I'm a great hip-hop fan, so obviously New York is a center point for hip-hop. Coming down here on the weekends, going to concerts and so on. I've always been a huge fan of New York City.
Well, I met Christopher when I was still at Atari. I saw Christopher as being like an astonishingly open and honest person. And there was a point when I was at Atari that I was very open and honest with him. And I said, look, without going into too much detail, just pack your bags, walk out of here, and never come back again, right? And I think it was that moment that we recognized, like, hey, you know what? We can be very open and honest with each other. This is someone that I really want to be in business with.
Going through a rough time or a difficult phase in any part of your life, or if you run a company, and it quickly shows who's standing by your side and who's not. And I've seen people that I thought were close to me just go away.
We've seen both the best and the worst that this business has to offer. What you realize is after you put in your 20 years in this business, ultimately your decisions are primarily based on what feels right instinctually. What happened wasn't so much about a business development relationship, it was more about a friendship. Christopher kept coming to New York very frequently. So eventually, after I left Atari, I just said, have you ever thought about opening a studio here? Christopher said, well, you know, from time to time. And I said, well, it's something that I've been dreaming about doing for the better part of the last 20 years. And since I was born and raised here, and wondering why it was that this city had never had sort of legitimate presence in the games development business. Eventually, Christopher said, well, show me what it's going to cost.
And that happened on the a restaurant called Dos Caminos over on Houston.
It's a Mexican restaurant.
Yeah, so yeah. Tequila and Coronas were involved. Like many things in Avalanche, we don't put too much thought into something. We like to dive headfirst into things.
I think both of us have the same mentality, that if you're going to do something of lasting value in this business, you've got to be willing to take a risk.
And say, well, f it, we're setting up a AAA studio in New York City. We get that question a lot, why we set up here in New York. So isn't that insanely expensive? But in reality, it's not.
People have asked us, you know, did we look at Montreal, did we look at Vancouver, Seattle, Los Angeles, San Francisco? Typically we say yes, but the truth is we actually didn't. We were completely focused on New York from day one, and there really was no other consideration. It was basically New York or nothing. It's a place where people feel they belong to something. When you come here and after a couple of years you're able to say, I'm a New Yorker, it's a sense that there's like something larger than yourself at work here. And that's a really powerful feeling that you don't get in a lot of places. What the city's always lacked is a heritage in game development. There have been studios here before us. The difference is that those studios were all owned by someone, whereas, you know, we're still privately held and independent. You know, 2 blocks up the street we have Rockstar, but Rockstar is still primarily a publishing and marketing operation. The actual development of their games is going on somewhere else. But for the most part, AAA development, you know, hasn't been here for a very long time.
So it's not about making huge profits. For us, opening up a studio in New York is a way for us to offer the opportunity for our employees and for people in the industry to work here in the greatest city in the world. That's the main reason. I mean, we didn't want to create like a profit center in New York City. It's never been our way of operating. You
know, for us it's the love of New York, but it's also looking at the fact that we don't have to compete. If we said, well, we are a mid-sized, privately held independent studio opening an office in Los Angeles, the first thing that we would run into is the competition that's created by having 50 other studios within a 20 square mile radius. You know, our pockets are only so deep, so when we look at companies like Activision or EA or Ubisoft, it's very difficult for us to compete with them. It's obviously a highly contested market for talent on the West Coast. And the same thing goes for Montreal or Seattle or San Francisco. By being in New York, we're in a place where we can essentially be a groundbreaking, brand new operation competing in a wide open market and giving people, as Christopher says, the opportunity to come back to a place where they were probably from. We think that there's a lot going on in Soho, and people are always surprised to find us here. We could just easily have been in Brooklyn, but we started looking here, and we found a space that we really liked. It's nice to be in a historic location These are actually landmark buildings that are protected by the city. So even breaking a hole through the wall, you have to get an official letter from the Landmarks Commission.
Any idiot can build up a big company. It's not that hard. But finding the right people and still maintain the company cultures is the hard part.
It was one of these things where it was, if we build it, will they come, right? Without the team, it doesn't have a lot of meaning, right? The studio is the team. Fortunately, I think the roll of the dice paid off. And it's amazing to see these people coming from all across the world to come back to New York and developing into a cohesive unit that is delivering a fantastic gameplay experience. Staff-wise, we're about 90 here. We don't want to get much bigger than that. Once the studio is the team, it goes over 100 people. The fun of managing that team tends to dissipate fairly quickly. We take a lot of pride in doing more with less. We're well aware that the game we're working on is a game that could easily be 300-400 people somewhere else. But I think what we've really excelled at is handpicking the best of the best.
You guys, when you first debuted the studio, announced it as you were working on Project Mamba. Yeah. Was that Just Cause 3 at the time? Was it always Just Cause 3?
Well, the studio was set up before. We started working on JC3 in early 2012. So bouncing around ideas and so on while the studio was being built up.
You want to talk about the difficulty of keeping Just Cause 3 a secret?
Christopher?
I talk too much. I think that's the hard part. It's so great to finally announce this game to the world. I know a lot of people have been waiting very patiently for it.
In a lot of ways we feel like it's one of the worst kept secrets in the industry. It wasn't necessarily hard for anyone to guess what exactly it is that we were doing here. But I think, for us, it's been 3 solid years plus, of like putting everything that we've got into this game, from building a team from scratch to starting a studio from scratch. The energy and the passion that's gone into this is something that sort of like pressure in a bottle building up. You just, want that cork to pop for people to finally be able to lay their eyes on what you've done. To say like, hey, we've arrived and this is, what the last 3 years have meant to us. To really legitimize New York, you've got to demonstrate that you can build a world-class team and deliver a world-class game. You have to love games and you have to love New York. And the combination of those two things is what makes this work, I think.
I'm the chairman of the Swedish developer organization, and the big successes of the Swedish game development community started with Battlefield. We have DICE to thank for a lot of things. With their success, it really just helped everyone else.
What you need is sort of that genesis moment. That moment in time where a studio is so successful that it actually launches the careers of other people. And that ultimately those studios feed back into our studio and vice versa, right?
I think that the industry as a whole don't need bigger developers, we need more developers. I hope really that we can inspire more developers to start up something. We all love games, and running your own studio and sort of fulfilling your own dreams is great. It's the best thing in the world.
Long term, we need to be able to change the perception of New York and really put New York on the map in terms of, hey, this is a city that can go toe-to-toe with any other city on the planet that's known as a hotbed of game development. It's going to take a lot of time to do that. And part of that is also changing the financial climate in New York as well, right? You mentioned the tax incentives in other cities. We want to make sure that New York pays attention to what we're doing and to bring around the same sorts of incentives to entice other companies to come here.
So step 1, make a great game with Just Cause 3.
Yeah.
And then you theoretically have the ammo to go to New York City Council or wherever you go to try and get them to institute more rebates.
Oh, we're already doing that. I can't go into too many details, but they are listening. The other thing I would mention is that we're also working with all the local universities, so NYU, Pratt, Parsons, FIT, because we also want to start an internship program here, because what we need to be able to do is train the next generation. It's just going to take time and energy to make sure that what we start here stays here. We have a 10-year lease in this building and we fully intend to be here for a decade and longer, taking on the responsibility of trying to change the landscape of what's happening here is, it is a big responsibility, but I think we relish that and we don't shy away from it.